September 1945. On a converted hospital ship cutting through the Pacific Ocean, 47 Japanese women were living through a nightmare that had nothing to do with bombs or battles. They had survived the war, survived the invasion of Saipan, survived internment camps and the chaos of defeat. But now, crammed into a cargo hold with their babies, they faced what they believed was a death sentence delivered in broken Japanese by a nervous American interpreter. Keep your babies silent or they will be thrown into the sea. For 8 days, these mothers would wage a silent war against nature itself, fighting their infant's most basic instinct to cry. Before we reveal how this terror unfolded and how one American corporal discovered the horrifying truth, tell us in the comments, have you ever experienced a dangerous misunderstanding? What happened when the truth finally came out? The USS Consolation had been a hospital ship during the island-hopping campaigns, her white hull marked with red crosses that were supposed to protect her from attack. Now, in the war's immediate aftermath, she had been repurposed for something the Navy called repatriation operations, a sanitized term for the messy business of sending thousands of Japanese civilians back to their devastated homeland. The cargo hold that once stored medical supplies now held human cargo, women who had lived on Saipan, Tinian, and other Pacific islands, all waiting to return to a Japan most of them barely recognized anymore. Keiko Yamamoto sat on the rough wooden platform that served as her bed, her 4-month-old daughter Yuki pressed against her chest. At 28, Keiko had the kind of face that looked older than her years, each line etched by specific losses she could name. The war had taken her husband Hiroshi, killed during the American invasion when he chose a grenade over capture. It had taken her home, her career as an elementary school teacher, her country as she knew it. All that remained was the warm weight of her daughter, and the songs she used to teach children, now hummed silently because making sound had become too dangerous. The hold smelled of unwashed bodies, sour milk, and salt water that seeped through the hull. 23 babies shared this space with their mothers, ranging from newborns to toddlers not yet 2 years old. In peacetime, in any rational world, this confined space would have been filled with the normal sounds of infant life: crying, cooing, fussing, laughing. Instead, an unnatural quiet pressed down on them all, broken only by the ship's engines and the whispered Japanese of women too terrified to speak at normal volume. 3 days into the journey, that terrible quiet had become their religion. Keiko watched Mrs. Sato across the hold, rocking her 6-week-old son with mechanical precision, her eyes glazed with exhaustion. The woman had not slept since they boarded. None of them had. Not really. How could you sleep when sleep meant your baby might cry, and crying meant death? They had organized themselves into shifts, the mothers taking turns staying alert, ready to soothe any infant who showed signs of distress before sound could escape. The order had come on their first day aboard. Lieutenant Morrison, the ship's executive officer, had appeared at the top of the ladder leading down into their hold. Keiko remembered his face, young, tired, irritated by the crying babies that had kept his crew awake the night before. He had called down for the interpreter, and Sergeant Takeshi Ito had appeared, a Nisei soldier whose parents had emigrated to California before he was born. Ito spoke English like an American and Japanese like a child who had learned it at home but never formally studied it. Morrison's words had been clear in English. "We need to establish some order down there. The constant crying is disturbing the crew's sleep. Tell them if the noise continues at this level, we'll have to move them to the deck storage area. It's more exposed to weather, but there's more space, and it won't disturb the men." Deck storage. A practical solution to a noise problem. But when Ito translated, something went catastrophically wrong. Japanese is a language of context, where the same sounds can mean different things depending on subtle variations in tone and the characters used to write them. The phrase for move to deck storage and throw to the sea share similar grammatical structures. Ito, nervous and imperfectly fluent, chose the wrong words, and cultural context did the rest. These women had lived through years of war propaganda about American brutality. They had heard stories, some true and some exaggerated, about atrocities on both sides. When Ito's frightened face delivered what sounded like a threat to throw crying babies overboard, it aligned perfectly with their worst fears about what victorious Americans might do to the families of their defeated enemy. Keiko had watched the message spread through the hold like a wave of ice water. She saw it in faces, in the way mothers clutched their babies tighter, in the sharp intake of breath, in eyes that went wide with terror and then narrow with grim determination. No one questioned the order. In their experience of war, orders from military authorities were not suggestions. They were survival instructions. The first night had been the worst. Yuki had been hungry, wanting to nurse every 2 hours as 4-month-olds do. But Keiko's milk supply, already diminished by months of malnutrition, had decreased further under the stress of travel. Yuki would latch on, suck desperately, find little nourishment, and begin to cry. The sound, so normal and necessary for a baby, became terrifying. Keiko would press her daughter close, covering her mouth gently, humming soundlessly, rocking, swaying, doing anything to distract from hunger and discomfort. Around her, other mothers fought the same battle. Mrs. Tanaka, a former midwife, walked endless circles in the small space with her baby boy, her lips moving in silent prayers. 3 teenage mothers, girls really, barely 17 or 18, huddled together, their babies born from the violence of the invasion. They helped each other, trading infants when arms grew too tired, sharing the meager resources they had. An older woman named Mrs. Yoshida, who had been a nurse in the Japanese military hospital on Saipan, moved from mother to mother with quiet efficiency, checking babies for fever, showing younger women techniques for soothing without sound. But techniques only went so far when babies were genuinely hungry, genuinely uncomfortable, genuinely in need of things their mothers could not provide. On the second night, Keiko witnessed something that would haunt her. Mrs. Sato's baby, the 6-week-old boy, had begun crying with the persistent wail of a child in distress. Mrs. Sato, her face a mask of terror, had placed her hand over the baby's mouth to muffle the sound. At first, it seemed like what all the mothers were doing, a gentle pressure to quiet the cry, but seconds stretched on. 5 seconds, 10, 15. The baby's face began to redden, his small body struggling against his mother's hand. Other mothers watched in frozen horror. If they intervened, if they made noise, would they all be thrown overboard? It was Keiko who finally moved. She crossed the small space and touched Mrs. Sato's arm gently. The woman's eyes were wild, unseeing. Keiko carefully removed the hand from the baby's face. The infant gasped, coughed, and then began crying louder. Mrs. Sato collapsed, sobbing silently, her whole body shaking. The baby's cries rang through the hold, and every mother held her breath, waiting for American footsteps, waiting for the punishment they believed would come. They heard boots on the deck above. The ladder creaked. A young American sailor appeared at the top of the opening, his red hair visible even in the dim light. Corporal James Sullivan was 22 years old, with a face full of freckles that made him look even younger. He had been assigned to the ship as a medical corpsman after taking shrapnel to his leg during combat. The injury had ended his fighting, but not his service. Sullivan descended halfway down the ladder and looked at the scene. 47 terrified women, 1 crying baby, an atmosphere of panic he could not understand. His face showed confusion, not anger. He held up his hands in a peaceful gesture. "Is the baby sick?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Does he need medical help?" No one answered. How could they, when they did not speak English and believed this man was here to carry out the execution order? The mothers pressed back against the walls of the hold, making themselves small, trying to disappear. Mrs. Sato held her baby out toward Sullivan in a gesture that broke his heart, though he did not understand it. She was offering her child, surrendering him, hoping that perhaps the Americans would at least let the other babies live. Sullivan's face went through several emotions: confusion, concern, and finally a deep sadness. He descended the rest of the ladder slowly, moving with exaggerated care to show he meant no harm. He approached Mrs. Sato with his hands visible, non-threatening, and gently examined the baby. The infant was burning with fever. Sullivan pulled out his medical kit and checked the baby's temperature, 103 degrees. He looked into the baby's ears and saw infection, red and angry. "He needs medicine," Sullivan said, more to himself than to anyone else, knowing they could not understand. He made a gesture, trying to indicate he wanted to take the baby to the medical bay. Mrs. Sato's reaction was immediate and visceral. She screamed, a sound of pure anguish, and clutched her baby tighter. Other mothers moved forward, creating a human barrier between Sullivan and the child. Sullivan stood in the middle of this incomprehensible tableau, completely baffled. He was trying to help. Why were they so afraid? He backed away slowly, climbed the ladder, and went to find the interpreter. Sergeant Takeshi Ito was reluctant to return to the cargo hold. He had felt the waves of fear when he delivered Morrison's message, had seen how his words landed like physical blows. But Sullivan insisted, his Iowa farm boy earnestness overriding Ito's hesitation. "That baby needs treatment," Sullivan explained. "He could die from that fever. We need to make them understand I'm trying to help." When they descended together, the mothers were waiting in tense silence. Ito spoke in his imperfect Japanese, explaining that the corporal only wanted to treat the sick baby, that he would bring the child back. But the mothers heard different nuances in his words. Bring back, like an object, like something that might not return whole. Their experience of war had taught them that promises made by authorities were not always kept. Finally, Keiko stepped forward. She was not the oldest mother, not the most senior in any formal way, but her years as a teacher had given her a certain authority, a habit of organizing chaos. She spoke to Ito in careful Japanese, asking him to clarify. Would the mother accompany her baby? Would they truly bring him back? Ito translated to Sullivan, who nodded vigorously. "Yes, absolutely. The mother comes too. I just need to treat him in the medical bay where I have supplies." The arrangement was made. Mrs. Sato, trembling, followed Sullivan up the ladder, her baby in her arms. The other mothers watched them disappear with the resignation of people who expected never to see them again. They settled in to wait, to pray, to hope against experience that this time the authorities would keep their word. 2 hours later, Mrs. Sato returned. Her baby was sleeping peacefully, his fever reduced by medication, an antibiotic cream applied to his infected ears. She descended the ladder like someone in a dream, unable to process what had happened. The American had been gentle. He had sung to her baby in English, some soft melody that sounded like a lullaby. He had given her extra formula, shown her how to mix it, ensured she understood the dosing schedule for the medicine. And then he had let them return. The mothers gathered around her, touching the baby gently, confirming he was real and whole and alive. Their worldview cracked slightly. Perhaps the Americans were not planning to kill them. Perhaps the threat had been misunderstood. But fear, once established, is not easily dislodged. What if Sullivan was an exception? What if his kindness was a trick? What if the next time a baby cried, the punishment would come? So the silence continued. By the 4th day, the physical toll had become impossible to ignore. Keiko could no longer produce any milk at all. Yuki had lost weight, her small face looking pinched and gray. Other babies showed similar signs. Dehydration, malnutrition, the lethargy that comes when infants give up crying because they have learned no one will adequately respond. The mothers themselves were hollow-eyed ghosts, swaying on their feet, hallucinating from sleep deprivation. Sullivan noticed. He made his rounds twice a day now, bringing what extra rations he could scrounge. Canned milk, crackers, sometimes fruit from the officers' mess. He watched the mothers with growing concern. Something was profoundly wrong, beyond the normal stress of a difficult journey. These women were pushing themselves past human limits, and he could not understand why. He tried to communicate, showing them a photograph he carried of his 3-month-old nephew back in Iowa. He pointed to the baby, then to his heart, smiling, trying to convey that he understood the love of family, that he saw their children as precious. Some mothers nodded politely, but he saw no real connection, no breakthrough in the wall of fear. On the 5th night, Keiko made a decision. Yuki was dying. Not dramatically, not with the sudden crisis of Mrs. Sato's baby, but with the slow fade of malnutrition. Her daughter's skin had taken on a grayish pallor. The soft spot on her head had sunken inward, a sign of severe dehydration. She barely cried anymore, lacking the energy even for that most basic protest. Keiko looked at her daughter's face and thought of Hiroshi, of the choice he had made at the end. The grenade, rather than capture. He had chosen what he believed was an honorable death over the uncertainty of surrender. Was she doing the same thing now? Choosing the certainty of silence and death over the risk of sound and possible life? She thought of the children she had taught, how she had always encouraged them to ask questions, to seek understanding, to not accept fear as truth without evidence. Sullivan had treated Mrs. Sato's baby with tenderness. He carried a photo of a child he loved. His eyes showed sadness, not cruelty, when he saw their suffering. Was it possible that the Americans did not want to harm their babies? Was it possible that Ito had made a mistake? The risk of testing this theory was death. But Yuki was dying anyway in silence. At dawn on the 6th day, Keiko stopped fighting her daughter's cries. Yuki, weakened and desperate, began to wail with what little strength she had left. The sound was not loud by normal baby standards, but in the enforced quiet of the hold, it rang out like an alarm. Every mother froze. Some pressed back against the walls. Others clutched their own babies tighter, as if they could protect them from what was coming. Keiko sat still, holding her crying daughter, her face a mask of forced calm, while her heart hammered against her ribs. This was the test. This would prove whether the threat was real or misunderstood. Either Americans would come and throw Yuki overboard, confirming their worst fears, or something else would happen, something that might offer hope. Footsteps sounded above, quick, concerned footsteps. The ladder creaked under weight. Sullivan appeared, descending rapidly, his medical kit in hand. He saw Keiko holding the crying baby, and his face transformed with concern. He crossed to her immediately, kneeling beside her, and reached for the baby with gentle hands. Keiko made a choice. She let him take Yuki. Sullivan cradled the infant, feeling how light she was, how her skin lacked the healthy elasticity of a well-fed baby. He looked at Keiko with alarm and compassion mixed together. "She is very sick," he said, knowing Keiko could not understand the words, but hoping his tone would convey meaning. "Please come with me. I need to help her." Keiko rose and followed him up the ladder, expecting nothing, fearing everything, hoping despite herself. In the medical bay, Sullivan worked quickly. He checked Yuki's vital signs and found what he feared: severe dehydration, malnutrition, a baby in medical crisis. He prepared an IV line with hands that shook slightly from the emotional weight of what he was seeing. A baby dying slowly because her mother was too terrified to let her cry for help. What kind of fear could drive a mother to that? He inserted the IV carefully, talking softly to Yuki in English the whole time. "It's okay, sweetheart. We're going to help you. You're safe now. You can cry all you want. Please cry. Crying is good. Crying is how you tell us you need something." He did not know if his words helped, but the tone seemed to soothe the baby, or perhaps it was simply the IV fluid beginning to rehydrate her small body. Keiko watched this American soldier treat her daughter with a tenderness that contradicted everything she had been told to believe. He wiped away the baby's tears. He adjusted the IV flow. He sang softly, some melody in English that she did not understand but recognized as the universal language of comfort. And his eyes, when he looked at Yuki, held the same expression Keiko had seen in Hiroshi's eyes when he looked at their newborn daughter, pure, uncomplicated love for an innocent life. When Sullivan finally turned to Keiko, his face was troubled. He called for Ito, needing to bridge the language gap for what he had to ask. When the interpreter arrived, Sullivan spoke slowly and clearly. "Ask her why she waited so long to get help. Ask her why all the mothers seem so afraid. This baby almost died. Others might be in similar danger. I need to understand what is happening." Ito translated, and Keiko answered, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. She explained about the order, about the threat to throw crying babies into the sea, about 6 days of desperate silence, about mothers on the edge of collapse trying to keep their children alive by keeping them quiet. As Ito translated her words back to English, Sullivan's face went white, then red, then white again. Throw babies in the sea? His voice was barely a whisper. We were going to throw babies in the ocean if they cried? He looked at Ito with something approaching horror. Is that what you told them? And then the terrible truth emerged, the mistranslation, the linguistic confusion, the cultural context that made a bureaucratic solution sound like a death threat. Ito's face crumbled as he realized his error, realized that his imperfect Japanese had created a nightmare that had been torturing 47 women and endangering 23 babies for nearly a week. "I will tell them," Ito said, his voice shaking. "I will explain my mistake." "No," Sullivan said firmly. "We will tell them, together, and then we are going to fix this. All of it." The descent into the cargo hold felt different this time. Sullivan carried Yuki, now stabilized with the IV drip running into her tiny arm, wrapped in a clean navy blanket that still smelled of laundry soap. Keiko walked beside him, her posture uncertain, caught between hope and the habit of fear. Ito followed behind, rehearsing in his mind how to explain the inexplicable, that he had accidentally sentenced these women to a week of torture through nothing more than imperfect vocabulary. The mothers saw them coming and rose as one, a wave of exhausted women moving toward Keiko with questions on their faces. Was she alive? Was the baby alive? What had the Americans done? Keiko raised her hand for silence, and the gesture carried the authority of her former life as a teacher. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but Sullivan could hear the tremor underneath. "I need you to listen," she said in Japanese. "Everything we believed about the threat was wrong." Ito stepped forward then, and his face showed the weight of what he was about to confess. He began to speak, his Japanese more careful now than it had been 6 days ago, each word chosen with the precision of someone who understood too late how much words could matter. He explained the original order from Lieutenant Morrison. He explained his mistake in translation, how the phrase for deck storage had come out as thrown to the sea in his nervousness and incomplete fluency. He explained that the Americans had never, not once, threatened to harm their babies. The silence that followed his confession was different from the silence of the past 6 days. That had been the quiet of suppression, of mothers fighting against nature to keep their children from making sound. This was the silence of shock, of minds trying to reorganize reality around a truth that seemed impossible. 6 days, 144 hours. They had kept their babies quiet for nearly a week because of words that were never meant to be spoken. Mrs. Sato was the first to break. She made a sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a sob, something between rage and relief and grief for the unnecessary suffering. Her body folded in on itself, and she collapsed to her knees, her hands pressed against her face. Other mothers followed, Mrs. Tanaka vomiting into a corner from the sudden release of stress, the 3 teenage mothers clutching each other and weeping, Mrs. Yoshida, the former nurse, simply staring at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. Sullivan watched this cascade of delayed trauma with horror spreading across his features. He had seen men break down after combat, had witnessed the psychological cost of war in 100 different ways. But this was different. This was suffering inflicted not by enemy action, but by the simple failure of understanding between people who shared a common humanity, but not a common language. He turned to Ito with barely controlled fury. "Get the ship's doctor. Get Lieutenant Morrison. Get everyone who needs to see this." His voice was low, the kind of quiet that signaled depths of anger beyond shouting. These women need to know that every person in authority on this ship understands what happened. They need to see American officers acknowledge this mistake. They need something more than just your apology and my word. While Ito ran to summon the ship's command, Sullivan did the only thing he could think to do. He sat down on the floor of the cargo hold, still holding Yuki, and he waited. Around him, mothers began to move. Some picked up their babies and held them close, rocking them not to prevent crying, but simply to feel the comfort of contact without fear. Others sat motionless, still processing. A few began to talk in rapid Japanese, their voices rising as the emotional dam broke. Keiko sat beside Sullivan, and though they shared no common language beyond a few basic words, something passed between them in that moment. She reached out tentatively and touched her daughter's hand, where it rested against Sullivan's arm. The baby's fingers reflexively gripped her mother's finger, that instinctive newborn grasp that speaks to the primal bond between parent and child. Sullivan carefully transferred Yuki back to Keiko's arms, making sure the IV line did not tangle. "I am sorry," he said in English, knowing she would not understand the words but hoping she would understand the intent. "I am so sorry this happened to you." Keiko looked at him with eyes that had seen too much, and she responded in Japanese, equally uncomprehending to him, but equally sincere. "You saved my daughter. You gave us truth. That is more than sorry." Within 20 minutes, the cargo hold filled with American naval personnel in a way it never had before. Captain William Harrison, the ship's commander, descended the ladder with the careful movements of a man in his 50s who spent most of his time on the bridge. Lieutenant Morrison followed, his young face showing confusion about why he had been summoned. Dr. Robert Chen, the ship's chief medical officer and a Chinese-American who had faced his own share of prejudice during the war, came with his medical bag, and Ito, pale and shaken, returned to translate. Captain Harrison stood before the assembled mothers, and Ito translated as the captain spoke. "I have been informed of what happened, of the order that was misunderstood, of the fear you have endured, of the danger your children faced, because we failed to communicate clearly." He paused, choosing his next words with visible care. "On behalf of the United States Navy, I apologize. This should never have happened. We failed in our duty to protect non-combatant civilians under our care." The mothers listened to Ito's translation with expressions ranging from disbelief to cautious acceptance. Apologies from military authorities were not part of their experience. In the Japanese military culture they had known, admitting error was shameful, to be avoided at almost any cost. That an American captain would stand before them and acknowledge failure was so outside their frame of reference that some women seemed not to know how to receive it. But Captain Harrison was not finished. He turned to Dr. Chen. "I want every baby examined immediately. I want every mother evaluated for medical needs. I want proper sleeping arrangements made, proper rations allocated, and I want a full report on my desk within 24 hours detailing how we prevent this from ever happening again." Dr. Chen nodded and immediately began organizing. Sullivan and 2 other corpsmen started triaging the babies, checking each one for signs of dehydration, malnutrition, or illness. Of the 23 infants, 18 needed medical intervention, 11 required IV fluids, 4 needed hospitalization in the ship's medical bay. The numbers told a story of crisis narrowly averted, of babies who had been days or even hours from serious medical emergencies. As the corpsmen worked, moving efficiently but gently among the mothers, something remarkable began to happen. The mothers started to help. Mrs. Yoshida, drawing on her nursing training, began assisting Dr. Chen, her hands remembering the motions of medical care. Mrs. Tanaka, the midwife, helped calm younger mothers who were anxious about the IV insertions. Even the teenage mothers, so young themselves, began to organize the baby's clothing and supplies, creating order from chaos in the way that humans do when trying to regain control after trauma. Sullivan found himself working alongside Keiko, who refused to leave Yuki's side, even as other babies needed attention. He showed her how to check the IV drip rate, how to watch for signs that the line might be infiltrating. She watched with the intense focus of someone memorizing information that might mean the difference between life and death. When he moved to the next baby, she followed, observing as he examined a 2-month-old boy with severe diaper rash and dehydration. The baby's mother, one of the teenagers, watched Sullivan with wide, fearful eyes. Through Keiko's halting English and gestures, Sullivan understood that this girl, probably no more than 17, had been assaulted during the invasion. The baby was a constant reminder of violence, yet she had fought desperately to keep him alive through 6 days of enforced silence. Sullivan felt his throat tighten. He treated the baby with extra gentleness, talking softly, making sure the young mother saw that he viewed this child not as the product of violence, but as an innocent life deserving of care. When he finished and handed the baby back, the girl said something in Japanese. Keiko translated haltingly. She says, "American soldiers, before, hurt her. You, different. You, kind." The broken English carried the weight of a profound shift in understanding. Sullivan nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. The work continued through the afternoon and into the evening. The medical bay was converted into a nursery, with cribs improvised from supply crates lined with blankets. Mothers were allowed to stay with their hospitalized babies, a violation of normal ship protocol that Captain Harrison authorized without hesitation. The remaining mothers and babies were moved from the cargo hold to a former officer's berthing area, cramped but vastly better than where they had been. Real beds, windows with actual light, and most importantly, a location where crying would not disturb the crew. Lieutenant Morrison, who had given the original order, approached Sullivan as the corporal was finishing his rounds. The lieutenant's face showed a complicated mix of defensiveness and genuine distress. "I never meant for any of this," he said. "I just wanted the men to get some sleep. I never imagined—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Sullivan looked at him for a long moment before responding. "No, sir, you did not imagine. None of us did. That is the problem." His voice held no accusation, just a bone-deep weariness. "We have been at war for so long that we forgot how to see them as anything but the enemy. We processed them like cargo because we could not imagine they might have reasons to be terrified of us. We assumed compliance meant understanding." Morrison nodded slowly. "Corporal, you have experience with these women now. Captain Harrison is forming a committee to develop new protocols. He wants your input." Over the next 3 days, as the ship continued its journey toward Yokohama, Sullivan became an unexpected bridge between two worlds. He spent his mornings in the medical bay caring for the sickest babies, his afternoons visiting the mothers in their new quarters, and his evenings in meetings with the ship's officers, helping to draft what would eventually become standardized protocols for the treatment of civilian repatriates. The relationship between Sullivan and Keiko deepened through this process, though it remained bounded by the constraints of language and circumstance. She began teaching him Japanese words, Akachan for baby, Okasan for mother, arigato for thank you. He taught her English in return. Bottle, diaper, medicine, safe. They created a shared vocabulary that existed in the space between their languages, a pigeon of necessity that allowed for basic communication and, occasionally, for something deeper. One evening, Sullivan found Keiko on the deck during the mother's allocated fresh air time. Yuki was in her arms, finally healthy enough to be without the IV, her small face regaining the roundness of proper infant nutrition. Keiko was looking toward the horizon where the sun was setting, painting the Pacific in shades of orange and red that reminded Sullivan of the skies over his family's farm in Iowa. He approached quietly and stood beside her, not speaking at first. Finally, Keiko broke the silence with halting English. "Tomorrow, we arrive Japan?" Sullivan nodded. "Tomorrow. Yokohama port. In the morning." Afraid, Keiko admitted, the English coming slowly but with clear intent. "Japan. Destroyed. My mother, I do not know. Alive? Dead?" Sullivan understood the fear in ways that transcended language. He had seen aerial photographs of Japanese cities, had heard the reports of devastation. These women were not returning home to victory parades and celebrations. They were returning to ruins, to occupation, to an uncertain future in a country that had been utterly transformed by defeat. "I will help," he said simply. "When we arrive, I will help you find your mother." Keiko looked at him with an expression that combined gratitude, disbelief, and something else harder to name. "Why?" she asked. Enemy. Japan and America. Enemy." Sullivan thought about this question, about the easy answer and the true answer. The easy answer was duty, was the compassion any decent person would show to civilians in need. But the true answer went deeper. "The war is over," he said finally. "You were never my enemy, Keiko. You are a mother. You love your daughter. You survived terrible things. That makes you brave, not enemy." She did not fully understand all his words, but she understood enough. She shifted Yuki in her arms, and with the hand that was free, reached out and briefly touched Sullivan's arm. The gesture was small but significant, a moment of connection that bridged the gap of language, culture, and history. In the berthing area that night, the mothers gathered and talked in ways they had not been able to do since the journey began. Some cried, finally processing the trauma of the past week. Others made plans, trying to prepare for the uncertainty of arrival. Mrs. Tanaka shared what she knew about conditions in Japan from letters that had reached her before her capture. Mrs. Yoshida talked about opportunities for women with medical training in the occupation hospitals. The teenage mothers who had formed their own support network made a pact to stay together if possible, to help each other navigate whatever came next. Keiko listened to these conversations, but found herself thinking about Sullivan, about the kindness he had shown when he had every reason to maintain distance and professional detachment. She thought about Hiroshi, about the husband she had lost, and felt a complicated grief. Not for what had been, but for what might have been if the war had never happened, if nations had found ways to see each other's humanity before conflict became inevitable. She looked down at Yuki, sleeping peacefully for the first time in a week, and made a private vow. She would tell her daughter this story someday, not to teach hatred of Americans or shame about being Japanese, but to teach the more complicated truth, that enemies were made by circumstance and politics, but humanity could be reclaimed by individual choices. Sullivan had made such a choice. He had seen suffering and responded with compassion. He had discovered error and worked to correct it. He had treated enemy civilians as humans deserving of dignity. If one person could do that, perhaps others could too. Perhaps that was how peace actually worked, not through treaties and formal surrenders, but through thousands of individual decisions to see the human being instead of the uniform, the person instead of the nationality. Dawn broke over Yokohama Harbor on October 1st, 1945, revealing a city caught between destruction and rebirth. Collapsed buildings stood beside hastily erected American installations, the old Japan and the occupied Japan existing in uneasy proximity. The mothers stood on deck watching their homeland emerge from morning mist, and the sounds they made were not of homecoming but of grief, of shock, of trying to reconcile memory with devastation. Keiko clutched Yuki tighter, staring at the ruins, thinking of Tokyo where her mother had been, wondering what could possibly remain. Sullivan had spent the early morning preparing packages for each mother, formula, medical supplies, and letters of introduction, explaining their circumstances and requesting assistance from occupation authorities. To Keiko's package, he added a personal note with his contact information and instructions for reaching aid organizations. In carefully practiced Japanese characters, he had written, "You are not alone. Help is available. Please ask for it." The disembarkation process moved with bureaucratic slowness. Mothers were verified, medically cleared, and assigned to assistance programs. Some had family contacts and received travel permits. Others, like Keiko, had no confirmed family and were directed to displaced persons facilities. When Keiko was assigned to a temporary shelter in Yokohama, Sullivan intervened. "Sir, this woman needs to search for her mother in Tokyo. Can we arrange transport?" The processing officer barely looked up. "Corporal, we process thousands weekly. She will register with the Red Cross and follow standard procedures. Next." Keiko touched Sullivan's arm and shook her head, understanding enough to know he was trying to help and being refused. "Through Ito," she said, "it is okay. I understand there are rules. I am grateful for everything you have already done." But Sullivan was not ready to accept defeat. That evening, he requisitioned a jeep and drove to the displaced persons shelter, a converted school building where Keiko shared a room with 6 other women and their babies. Through a translator, he explained he could help search for her mother through military channels. "Why would you do this?" Keiko asked. "Your duty to me ended when we reached land." Sullivan looked at this woman who had taught him about courage and the cost of misunderstanding. "Because I can," he said simply. "Because letting you search alone when I can help would make me complicit in unnecessary suffering." Over 4 days, Sullivan became a man on a mission. He used every military contact, called in favors, and navigated occupation bureaucracy with fierce determination. He contacted the Red Cross Tracing Service, filed requests with rebuilding government offices, checked hospital records and shelter registries. On the 5th morning, a textile factory worker in Kawasaki responded. A woman named Nakamura Hana, age and address matching, had registered seeking employment. Sullivan found Keiko helping care for other mothers' babies. When she saw his face, she knew something had changed. Through the translator, he explained what he had found. Keiko's reaction was not immediate joy, but stillness, her face showing complicated emotions. What if it is not her? What if she does not want to see me? What if she blames me for surviving when others died? What if she is ashamed that I was captured instead of choosing death? Sullivan had not anticipated these fears. The translator explained the cultural context. The shame of surrender, the expectation that civilians would choose death over capture, how survival could be interpreted as failure. "There is only one way to find out," Sullivan said gently. "Not knowing is its own kind of suffering." The next morning, they drove to Kawasaki through landscape showing war's full spectrum, untouched neighborhoods, areas reduced to rubble, everything in between. At the textile factory, the manager confirmed that yes, Nakamura Hana worked here, and yes, her shift would end in 1 hour. They waited outside in nervous silence. When workers emerged, Keiko scanned each face with desperate intensity. Then she saw her, a woman who looked far older than 54, thin and worn, gray hair, moving with careful slowness. But her face, even aged and weary, was unmistakably the face Keiko had known all her life. "Okasan," Keiko whispered, barely audible. She stepped from the jeep, Yuki in her arms, and simply stood there, waiting. Afraid to call out, afraid of rejection, but unable to walk away. The older woman stopped, stared, her face transformed, shock to recognition, to something like pain. She took one step toward Keiko, then another, Then she was running, tiredness forgotten. They met in the dusty street, and the sound Nakamura Hana made when she embraced her daughter was grief and joy and relief compressed into a single cry. Sullivan watched with tears streaming down his face. Eventually, they separated enough to look at each other. Hana touched Keiko's face as if confirming reality. Then her eyes fell on the baby. Keiko explained in tumbling Japanese, Hiroshi's death, Yuki's birth, the capture, the terrible voyage, the American who saved them. Hana took Yuki and held her granddaughter for the first time. "She is beautiful," she said softly. "She looks like you when you were born, like Hiroshi around the eyes. I thought I had lost everything. I thought you were dead. But you are here, and you brought me the future." She looked toward Sullivan. "That is the American?" "His name is James Sullivan. He saved Yuki's life. He helped me find you. Even though we were enemies, he chose to be kind." Sullivan approached and bowed. Hana, still holding Yuki, bowed back. Then, in halting English, "Thank you. You bring my daughter. You save my granddaughter. I have no words. Enough." Over 3 weeks, Sullivan continued helping, navigating bureaucracy, bringing supplies, filing paperwork for housing and employment assistance. In the process, he discovered that the real work of ending war was not fighting, but healing. Every mother comforted, every bureaucratic obstacle overcome. These were the actions that actually created peace. On his last visit before reassignment, Sullivan brought a final gift, a small jade pendant that had belonged to his grandmother. "I want Yuki to have it," he insisted when Keiko protested. "You have taught me something important," he said through a translator, "that seeing the enemy as human does not make you weak. It makes peace possible. I will never forget you or Yuki." In halting English, Keiko replied, "I tell Yuki about you. I tell her American soldiers save her life. I tell her enemies can become friends. She grow up knowing this." They bowed one final time. As Sullivan drove away, Keiko stood with Yuki and her mother, watching until the jeep disappeared. Captain Harrison's report led to sweeping changes. The protocol for humane treatment of non-combatant repatriates became standard, cultural liaison training mandatory, translation verification systems established, maternal health expertise assigned to every vessel. These changes prevented countless similar incidents through the Korean War, Vietnam, and beyond. Sullivan became a pediatric nurse, teaching cultural sensitivity for 30 years. Keiko became an English teacher, wrote a memoir in 1985 that became a bestseller. In 1995, at a reconciliation conference in San Francisco, they reunited on stage. The image of two elderly people embracing, one Japanese, one American, both transformed, became iconic. Sullivan died in 1998 at 75. Keiko lived until 2011, dying at 94. Yuki honored her promise, writing memoirs, producing documentaries, giving a TEDx talk viewed millions of times. A memorial was dedicated in Yokohama in 2020, featuring photos of Sullivan and Keiko from their 1995 reunion alongside a plaque that reads in both English and Japanese. On these waters, fear nearly destroyed 23 innocent lives. One act of compassion changed military policy forever. Let this remind us, in every conflict, we choose whether to see enemies or humans. Choose humanity. 79 years after 8 days of terror on a converted hospital ship, the descendants of those mothers and that corporal gather annually at the memorial. They come from Japan, America, and countries around the world. Diplomats, doctors, teachers, artists, ordinary people living extraordinary lives that exist because someone chose verification over assumption, because someone chose to see mothers and babies instead of enemy nationals, because individual acts of compassion can ripple forward through generations. The story of the USS Consolation is not a story of dramatic heroism or battlefield courage. It is something both simpler and more profound. A story of misunderstanding corrected, of suffering acknowledged, of systems changed because individuals refuse to accept that this is how things are done. It is a story that reminds us that the most important battles are sometimes fought not with weapons, but with words, not through violence, but through the persistent, difficult, essential work of actually seeing each other across the divides we create. And it is a story that asks each person who hears it, when faced with the choice between assuming the worst and seeking to understand, between following protocol and advocating for the vulnerable, between seeing enemies and seeing humans, what will you choose?